So there's a claim circulating in pseudo-submitter hypocrite camp, which is saying that anyone who calls themselves a leader of submission is by that claim alone a hypocrite. So we're going to go through this and basically collapse that claim and how they're actually twisting the messenger's words. And as always, hypocrites do not understand the Quran. They don't have access to it. This is what God commands us to do, which is to pray for leadership. And the Quran tells us about imams within the religion. So the claim is that anyone who refers themselves a leader of submission is, by the very act of making that claim, automatically a hypocrite. Pay attention to that. The argument is that is usually propped up by a paraphrase attributed to Rashad Khalifa. And this is what he says. The worst hypocrites are the ones who believe they are the leaders of submission. So dressed up in that borrowed authority, the claim functions as a preemptive disqualification. Any organizer, teacher, study circle, host, coordinator who steps forward is suspected, accused, and dismissed without examination of their actual work. So that's the move that we want to refute. Let's start with what Rashad actually said. Listen carefully here what he actually says. He was answering a question about who inhabits the lowest pit of hell, mentioned in chapter 4. His answer: a good example of the hypocrite, if I may say so, is Khomeini, for example. Because before the whole world looks at them as Muslims. They are acting in the name of Islam. So here it's naming Khomeini, right? Who's an Iranian Shia Ayatollah executing dissenters in the name of Islam. The institutional frame is Islam. He doesn't say leader of submission. He doesn't say submission at all, actually. So the hypocrite's paraphrase performs a single decisive operation. It replaces Khomeini, someone who suppresses, oppresses, a dictator who's killing women, kids, you name it, anyone who's fighting him. Thank God for their destruction, with leaders of submission, and saying that's acting in the name of Islam. But then replacing that with claiming leadership of submission. That looks like a small swap. It isn't. It inverts his teaching. It weaponizes a quote about priestly classes of traditional Islam against the very community Rashad spent his life building. This is the verse in the Quran that gives us the detection of hypocrites. Notice it doesn't talk about leaders of submission. This is what the Quran says. If we will, we can expose them for you so that you may recognize them just by looking at them. However, you can recognize them by the way they talk. God is fully aware of all your works. Two things at once. First, God can expose the hypocrites to the believers, meaning the believers are not commanded to act as though detection is impossible. You can find out who the hypocrites are. They speak a certain way. They use double speech. They prevent what God authorizes and authorizes what God prohibits. Second, the actual root the verse names is the way they talk. Their speech gives them away, not their title, not their office, not the role they claim. Their speech. That placed detection on solid ground. We listen to what they say openly, compare it to the revealed word, compare what is said in one room with what is said in another. You don't need to be a genius. If someone says they're an atheist and someone says that atheist can be my leader or imam in prayer, that person by proxy is inherently a hypocrite. God does not allow atheists or disbelievers to lead your prayers. They can't even be imams. So what is the Quran? So chapter 2 verse 8, then there are those who say we believe in God on the last day while they are not believers. That's the definition. The gap between what comes out of the mouth and what sits in the heart. Then 6 verses later, double-tongued version of the same pattern. Chapter 2 verse 14, when they meet the believers, they say we believe, but when alone with their devils, they say we are with you. We were only mocking. Same speaker to audience, contradictory messages. So this is the nature of how a hypocrite behaves. In front of others, they profess belief, piety. Look, I'm only asking for an atheist to be pious by praying, or a murderer, or a rapist. That's righteous, right? For them to pray to God? No, God says this is not a righteous act. In Surah 107, it says, woe to those who in their prayer are heedless. Woe. Woe means a condemnation. You can't get to prayer if you don't believe. And God says that your works only count while believing. So Rashad warns us about the hypocrites, and he calls them the worst kind. This is in Messenger Audio 29, around 39 minutes. When a person comes to you with the Quran at his armpit and says you don't believe that this is complete, God says this is complete. And he says this is not complete. That's a hypocrite. And he's worse because he appears to be righteous, usually very eloquent. That's the worst. That's the worst kind. So that's the point. A hypocrite is someone that comes to you professing or projecting belief when in their hearts they harbor disbelief, because a believer would not qualify a disbeliever as their leaders. A believer would not authorize an atheist, a hypocrite, a Christian, a Jew, an agnostic, whatever, to become their leaders in their faith. That has never happened before in the history of time. But the hypocrites will do that, and they hide behind the argument that God specifically prohibits things in the Quran, meaning that if you say something is prohibited that God didn't specifically prohibited, you would be a hypocrite. Well, God didn't specifically say torture is prohibited, for example. So if someone says torture is prohibited, does that mean they're a hypocrite? No, that's by inference in the verses of the Quran. God condemns any form of sin. God condemns gross behavior. But in this instance, God did actually condemn people who pray in a hypocrite masjid. 9:107, 108 specifically identifies the hypocrites, and God says you shall never pray in such a masjid. Now, at a minimum, the hypocrite has to accept that verse is there. There is a prohibition about some kind of masjid. They'll dance around this and they'll say, oh, actually, that's a specific kind of masjid. It's a Sunni masjid, or it's someone that declares war to God in the mosque for some reason, right? Or they practice idol worship. They're not doing the God alone salat, whatever. But at a minimum, the prohibition is there. The hypocrite is the worst kind because they'll come to you holding the Quran, cite some verses of the Quran, and confuse you. This isn't like a Sunni coming up to you and using the Hadith to confuse you, or a Jewish or a Christian person coming to confuse you with the Torah or the Bible, using the Quran to manipulate the truth and using their tongues to fabricate a lie and attributing it to God. That's the worst kind. So leadership is not a slur. Right? God uses in 3 verses how this is a righteous thing. It's something you should be aiming for, actually. In 2:124, God says, recall that Abraham was put to the test by his Lord through certain commands, and he fulfilled them. God said, I am appointing you an imam for the people. Abraham then asks, are you also appointing in my descendants? And God says, no, my covenant does not extend to the transgressors, meaning transgressors like disbelievers, like atheists, like hypocrites, or whomever. God identifies a set of people that are transgressors. They do not qualify the imamate role, the leadership role. But notice, God is talking about a leadership. So if the Quran is talking about leadership, why is the hypocrite saying that anyone who claims to be a leader is automatically a hypocrite? That's nonsensical, right? In 25:74, the righteous pray for this. Our Lord, let our spouses and children be the source of joy for us and keep us in the forefront of the righteous. Forefront of the righteous. That forefront word is imam, right? To be at the front of the righteous group, you are the leader of that group. In every community, in every group of people, there are leaders. There are packs that form because, as the Quran says, God made us communities like the ants, the bees. We are the same. And so the very notion that just declaring yourself a leader makes you a hypocrite is in itself hypocritical. A hypocrite that declares themselves a leader would be a hypocrite leader. But a submitter who declares themselves a leader, I mean, if that's their position, is the leader of that community, right? You are the leader of your community. Or maybe you're a follower of that community. But that community is what defines you, not the position within that community, nor the profession of you saying, oh, look, I'm the leader of this community, therefore you're a hypocrite. Rashad never said that. Anyone attributing that to Rashad would be lying. 28:5. We will to compensate those who were oppressed on earth and to turn them into leaders and make them the inheritors. This is what God does. God makes the people that were oppressed into leaders. This is what happens. Now I understand the gesture to say, look, if you're a leader, you shouldn't be going around telling people you're a leader, right? It's like, let's say you're smart, you go around, oh, look how smart I am. I get that. But if that's your position, let's say you're a general in an army and you declare yourself as a general in an army, that's just your position, right? You shouldn't be boastful about it. But if it's a truthful statement and you are the general of the army, someone asks you, what's your position? I'm the general of the army. That doesn't itself make you a hypocrite. God tells you what a hypocrite is, and we spoke about that in 47:30. 4:59. This is the verse that anchors obedience. O you who believe, you shall obey God, and you shall obey the messenger and those in charge among you. If you dispute an matter, you shall refer it to God and the messenger. If you do believe in God and the last day, this is better for you and provides you with the best solution. Here, again, leaders among you. 3 obedience objects. 2 of them, God and the messenger. That's unconditional. The third, those in charge among the believers. That's conditional. And the condition is set by the very next sentence, which is if you dispute, go back to God and the messenger. That's the final authority. So the leader among you can be obeyed in 4:59. That's the only legitimate connection point. This is not blind obedience. This is obedience based on the Quran. So Rashad also said about this, he said, don't follow me, right? He explicitly refused to be the followed personally. Obviously, he doesn't mean don't obey him as a messenger. He's simply saying don't add me to your shahada, right? So here he's saying we are not following Muhammad. We are not following Rashad Khalifa. We're not following any human being. And don't let anybody tell you that. I don't follow Rashad Khalifa and you don't follow Rashad Khalifa. We follow the words of God, which we read earlier. The words of God leads to leadership. This is what God authorized. And the words of God leads to prohibition or disallowance of praying behind a hypocrite or a false god. That's obvious. And so people get this confused quite a lot. They say, well, I don't follow Rashad Khalifa, right? I follow myself, my own ego. God identifies these people. 25:43. There are those who follow their own egos. Will you be their advocate? This is the hypocrites. Most Quranists are in this shed because they believe the Quran is a free-for-all DIY religion. I can just build my religion to suit my needs. Whatever I want, I'm just going to make it up. That's my religion. No, that's not consistent because the Quran tells you to obey the messenger. And the Quran speaks of the messenger of the covenant in 381. وَإِذَا خَلَ اللَّهُ مِيثَاقَ مِنَ النَّبِيِّينَ لَمَا آتَيْتُكُم مِّن كِتَابٍ وَالْحِكْمَةٍ ثُمَّ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا مَعَكُمْ. We have made them we have taken a covenant from the prophets and we've given the scripture and the wisdom. Afterwards, in 381, it's saying afterwards, and this covenant includes Muhammad, we will bring a clarifying messenger. مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا مَعَكُمْ. There will come a messenger that will clarify things for you. This is the whole point. Clarifying messenger clarifies the purpose, the reasoning of the Quran, gives you the rights of the religion without any confusion. So this is how it works, right? The Quran is already identifying these key traits of the hypocrites. This is duplicity manifest. God tells us, 33:1, do not obey the disbelievers and the hypocrites. This is repeated in 33:48, also expanding, saying you should disregard their insults. God says in 9:73 that you should strive against and be stern towards the hypocrites. God says in 66:9 that you should struggle against the hypocrite. God says in 4:138 you should inform the hypocrites of a painful retribution. God says in 481 that you should disregard the hypocrites and trust in God. God says in 984 that you cannot pray for the hypocrites. So if you can't even stand on their grave after they've died, how can you even elect them as your leader? That doesn't make sense. In 60:13, God says, do not befriend them. So it's clear that the hypocrites here has an identity of hypocrisy. It's not whether they're leaders or whether they're followers or whether they're sheep or whatever they might parrot to you. It's who they are, right? If they reject the messenger and fight the messenger, they are automatically a hypocrite. And every one of them presupposes that the believer has identified the hypocrite by name and category. You cannot strive against a category you refuse to name. You cannot withhold funeral prayer from someone whose hypocrite status you treat as unsayable. Labeling is mandatory because the action God commands cannot be performed without identification first. So listen first and then apply the command. So you just listen to what they're saying, and if they're using double speech, duplicitous statements, right? That's your cue to identify that this is a hypocrite. Anyone who disobeys the messenger of God is immediately a hypocrite. If they reject that Christian marriage is permissible per the Quran and per the messenger's teaching, they're a hypocrite. If they reject that anyone who dies before the age of 40 is immediately admitted to paradise, they're a hypocrite. If they reject messenger's arbitration that insurance is prohibited, any kind of insurance, unless forced, they are hypocrite. If they reject the notion that installing Satan or a false god as your leader is not prohibited in the Quran, they are a hypocrite. That's not hard to identify. You can listen to them and you can tell they cannot answer simple questions. That's the nature of a hypocrite. They simply refuse to obey. Their God is their ego. That's the obedience element to the messenger. And God tells us we should disregard them. We cannot obey them. We have to be stern with them. We have to inform them of a painful retribution. You cannot befriend them. You can't observe their funeral prayer. So these commands exist in the Quran. And if you don't apply them, you're missing out. Probably because you're reading the Sijin instead of the Eliyin.